Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, our mission is to really dig into the years 1848 to 1854. Our sources often call this the sectional struggle.
That's right. It's this incredibly tense period, basically the 7 years where the fuse leading to the Civil War was lit and just started burning down.
And we're going to try and trace exactly how the whole national political system started to fracture and break apart.
Yeah, it kicked off almost immediately after the Mexican War ended in 48. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it gave the U.S. this massive chunk of land, the Mexican Cession.
Right.
But that acquisition instantly triggered what one reading called a perilous round of political warfare. Suddenly, this huge question mark hangs over everything.
The big one. Could slavery expand into this new territory? And you had the northern anti-slavery folks pushing hard for the Wilmot Proviso right away.
Which was a clear, absolutely no slavery allowed in any territory gained from Mexico.
But Southern senators, well, they obviously weren't going to let that pass. They blocked it.
And the critical thing for you to understand is how this one issue, slavery's expansion, it threatened to just shatter the two main political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats.
Because they were the only real national institutions left, weren't they? The only things holding North and South together politically.
Exactly. So the parties, knowing this, they kind of adopted this strategy of silence, trying desperately to just sit on the lid, keep the slavery issue contained.
Trying to quiet down those Southern nationalists, the fire eaters.
Right. But you can only stay quiet for so long. By the 1848 election, the Democrats needed a candidate, and they picked Lewis Cass.
Ah, yes, General Cass, the supposed father of popular sovereignty.
And this idea, popular sovereignty, was meant to be the escape valve for the whole pressure cooker.
Okay, so break that down for us, because on the surface, it sounds pretty reasonable, even democratic, right? Let the people living in the territory decide for themselves if they want slavery or not.
That was definitely the appeal. Self-determination, the people decide. And politicians in Washington, they loved it. It meant they could dodge the issue, toss the hot potato right into the laps of the territorial governments.
Sounds almost too neat. So why were people in the North so wary of it then? What was the catch?
Well, the catch, the fatal defect, as the sources call it, was the fear that it could actually spread slavery. If each new territory could vote yes, where does it stop?
Ah, okay. So it wasn't a guaranteed stopgap. It could actually enable expansion.
Precisely. And that fear, combined with the main parties just trying not to talk about slavery,
that creates an opening, doesn't it?
It does. It leads directly to the formation of the Free Soil Party. And it's important to remember, they weren't just about the morality of slavery. They had a very specific economic argument.
Their slogan tells you a lot. Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men.
Yes. And that free labor part is crucial. Their opposition wasn't just abstract. It was about protecting the economic prospects of, free white workers. They argued that if you had slavery in the territories, free white farmers and workers couldn't compete. Slave labor would undercut wages, destroy their chances for self-employment, for upward mobility. They wanted things like free government homesteads, too, to secure land for independent farmers.
So it's an economic self-preservation argument aimed squarely at Northern workers.
Exactly. And it was potent. The Free Soilers didn't win the 1848 election, but they pulled enough Democratic votes away, especially in New York, where former President Van Buren ran as their candidate.
That they actually tipped the election to the Whig candidate, Zachary Taylor.
The irony. Taylor, a war hero, the hero of Buena Vista, but also a Louisiana slave owner, gets elected because an anti-slavery third party split his opponent's vote.
Politics makes strange bedfellows. But Taylor doesn't get much breathing room, does he? Because something totally unexpected happens out west.
Gold. January 1848. Sutter's Mill, California. Suddenly, everything changes.
The gold rush. The 49ers. Thousands pour in, leading to, pretty predictable chaos, right? Crime. Makeshift justice.
Vigilantism, yeah. But also, as the sources point out, a kind of unique social mix. You had people from all over the world, even former slaves like James Williams mentioned in one reading, all seeking their fortune.
But the really explosive part was political. California fills up so fast.
So fast that by 1849, they skipped the whole territorial phase, drafted a constitution that banned slavery, and applied directly for statehood.
And that just throws the whole system into crisis, because the Senate was perfectly balanced, wasn't it?
Perfectly. 15 free states, 15 slave states. California coming in as free state number 16 would shatter that balance probably forever. The South saw it as a disaster.
So Southern anger is boiling over California, but there was another issue constantly simmering too, right? The Underground Railroad.
Absolutely. This was a huge source of friction. You have this informal network, these stations and conductors helping enslaved people escape north.
We all know the stories, like Harriet Tubman, Moses, making those incredible journeys, rescuing hundreds. What was the political fallout?
For the South, it felt like theft, obviously, but also betrayal. They were furious about northern states passing these personal liberty laws.
What did those laws do?
They essentially hampered the enforcement of the existing Fugitive Slave Act. Things like forbidding state officials from helping federal agents capture runaways. The South felt the North was deliberately ignoring its constitutional obligations.
And the sources emphasize it wasn't just about the lost property value, was it?
No, not entirely. It was deeply tied to this sense of loss of honor, a feeling that the North was breaking faith, undermining their way of life, and the constitutional bargain. They demanded a much tougher fugitive slave law.
Which brings us right into the thick of it. Congress, 1850, the showdown, and the return of the immortal trio.
Yes, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, steps up one last time. He proposes a whole package of compromises, urging concession from both sides, and he has help from the younger Stephen Douglas, the little giant, who is really instrumental in packaging and managing the legislation.
But not everyone was looking for compromise. John C. Calhoun makes his last stand, too.
It's incredibly dramatic. Calhoun is too ill, too weak to even deliver his own speech. He has it read for him. And he rejects Clay's plan entirely. Says it's not enough.
And what was his alternative? It sounds pretty out there.
It was completely unworkable. Calhoun proposed having two presidents, one for the North, one for the South, each with a veto over all federal legislation.
Two presidents? How could that possibly function?
It couldn't. It would basically formalize the split.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to pass any law if both a Northern and Southern president had to agree. It guaranteed gridlock, essentially dissolving the Union's executive power. It was a measure of Southern desperation, really.
Wow. Okay, so on the other side, you have Daniel Webster giving his famous 7th of March speech. He argues for compromise.
He does. And a key part of his argument, trying to calm Northern fears and Southern demands about the Mexican Cession territory, was this idea about geography.
Right, the Almighty God argument.
Exactly. Webster argued Congress didn't need to pass the Wilmot Proviso for that land because, well, God already had. He claimed the climate, the arid land, it just wasn't suitable for the kind of large-scale plantation slavery the South relied on.
A powerful argument for moderation at the time apparently shifted some opinions in the North towards accepting a compromise.
It did. Though, historically speaking, his prediction about the climate absolutely preventing slavery expansion turned out to be quite wrong. But it served its purpose in 1850.
Okay, so after all the speeches, the maneuvering, what did the final compromise of 1850 actually contain? Let's break it down.
It was essentially 5 separate bills passed as a package. Okay, so concessions to the North. California admitted as a free state. That was huge. And the slave trade, not slavery itself, but the buying and selling was abolished in the District of Columbia.
Okay, what did the South get in return?
2 big things related to territory. The rest of the Mexican Cession was organized into New Mexico and Utah territories, and the slavery question there would be decided by popular sovereignty. Plus, Texas got $10 million for giving up some disputed land claims.
But there was one more piece, the one that really poisoned the well.
The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, nicknamed the Bloodhound Bill.
Oh.
This was the real kicker and arguably the most consequential part.
Why was it so much harsher than the old one?
Oh, in several ways. First, any black person accused of being a fugitive slave could be arrested, and crucially, they were denied the right to testify in their own defense. No jury trial either.
No jury trial. So who decided?
A federal commissioner. And here's the part that looked like, well, a bribe. The commissioner got paid $5 if they decided the person was free, but $10 if they decided the person was a slave and should be returned south.
That's outrageous. It directly incentivizes ruling against freedom.
Absolutely. And maybe the most inflammatory part for Northerners. The law required ordinary citizens to help federal marshals capture suspected fugitives if called upon. You could be deputized on the spot. Refusal meant fines or jail time.
So suddenly, slavery wasn't some distant Southern problem. It was potentially right there on your doorstep, and you could be forced to participate.
Exactly. And that's why the law was such a colossal blunder for the South, strategically speaking. It backfired spectacularly. Instead of securing cooperation, it enraged moderate Northerners. People who maybe weren't abolitionists before now saw the brutal reality of slavery enforcement up close.
So the compromise wasn't seen as a final piece.
Not in the North, not after the Fugitive Slave Law. It became this constant, infuriating reminder. It fueled resistance, more personal liberty laws in defiance, more rescues. It strengthened the anti-slavery movement enormously.
And this directly feeds into the next election, 1852, and the collapse of one of the major parties.
The Whigs. The compromise of 1850 essentially killed the Whig Party. They tried to nominate a safe bet, another military hero, Winfield Scott.
But the party just couldn't hold together, could it?
No. Their platform endorsed the compromise, including the Fugitive Slave Law. Northern Whigs couldn't stomach that. They deeply distrusted the platform. Southern Whigs, meanwhile, they liked the platform but didn't trust the candidate, Scott, to actually enforce it vigorously enough.
Oh, they were split north and south. Damned if they did, damned if they didn't.
Precisely. The party just disintegrated over that fault line. The Democrats, meanwhile, nominated Franklin Pierce, a Northerner, but very sympathetic to Southern interests, a pro-Southern Northerner. He won easily.
And the death of the Whigs is a huge moment. It signals the end of truly national parties that could bridge the sectional divide.
It really does. And with the political system fracturing, you see Southern ambitions flare up again. This idea of manifest destiny gets a new Southern twist.
Driven by what the sources call Slavocrats, Southern expansionists looking for new territory, specifically territory suitable for slavery, to try and restore that sectional balance they lost when California came in free.
They start looking south, mainly. Get these frankly audacious schemes, like William Walker, this adventurer, the gray-eyed man of destiny.
He actually took over a country.
For a time. He managed to install himself as president of Nicaragua in 1856 and immediately legalized slavery there. It was short-lived, though. He was overthrown and eventually executed in 1860.
And then there was Cuba, always a target for annexation.
A long-standing goal for some Southerners. This leads to the Ostend Manifesto in 1854, secretly drafted by American diplomats in Europe.
What did it propose?
It urged the U.S. government to offer Spain $120 million for Cuba, and if Spain refused, the manifesto argued the U.S. would be justified in wresting it from them. Basically take it by force.
Wow. How did that go over?
Terribly. It led to the press, and Northern opinion exploded. They called it the Manifesto of Brigands, just naked aggression to expand slavery. The Pierce administration had to completely back down and disavow the whole thing.
So the slavery issue is now actively blocking expansionist goals.
It is. But expansion was still happening elsewhere, opening up the Pacific. We should mention those developments, too.
Right, like Cushing's treaty with China back in 1844.
Yeah, that secured most favored nation status for the U.S., meaning any trade deal China gave another country, the U.S. got automatically. And crucially, extraterritoriality.
What did extraterritoriality mean, practically?
It meant American citizens accused of crimes in China wouldn't be tried in Chinese courts under Chinese law. They'd be tried by American officials under American law, a major concession of sovereignty by China.
And then, a decade later, Commodore Perry and the opening of Japan?
Matthew Perry, 1853 and 1854. He sails into Tokyo Bay with his black ships, these steam-powered warships that just awed and intimidated the Japanese. It led to the Treaty of Kanagawa, cracking open Japan's centuries of isolation to U.S. trade.
Okay, so Pacific trade is opening up. California is booming. This all points to one massive need, doesn't it?
A transcontinental railroad, absolutely essential to connect the West Coast, especially California, to the rest of the country. The question was where to build it.
And the route mattered, right? Because of geography and politics.
Immensely. The easiest road, terrain-wise, seemed to run south of the Rockies, through territory still held by Mexico near the border.
Which leads to the Gadsden Purchase.
Yep, 1853. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, a Southerner, pushes hard for it. The U.S. pays Mexico $10 million for a relatively small stint of land in present-day Arizona and New Mexico. Why? To secure that southern railroad route.
But not everyone wanted a southern route.
Definitely not. Enter Stephen Douglas again, the senator from Illinois. He wants the railroad terminus to be in Chicago. Good for his state, good for his own investments, probably too.
So he needs a northern route to be viable. But that land was unorganized territory.
The huge Nebraska territory. To make a northern rail route feasible, it needed to be organized, settled, governed. So Douglas proposes a bill in 1854, his counterstroke.
What was the plan?
Slicing the Nebraska territory into two. Kansas to the south, Nebraska to the north. And crucially...
Let me guess. Popular sovereignty.
You got it. Let the settlers in Kansas and Nebraska decide for themselves whether to allow slavery.
But wait. That land, Wasn't it covered by the Missouri Compromise?
Exactly. That's the bombshell. All of that territory was north of the 36-degree 30-meter line established in 1820. The Missouri Compromise had explicitly forbidden slavery there for over 30 years.
So Douglas's bill wasn't just organizing territory, it was proposing to repeal a foundational compromise that had held the peace more or less for a generation.
He was ready to do it. He argued popular sovereignty was the fairer, more democratic way, and he needed Southern votes to pass his bill and get his railroad.
How did the North react to throwing out the Missouri Compromise?
With absolute fury. They saw it as a shocking breach of faith, a betrayal. Douglas was denounced across the North, called a Judas, a traitor. Anti-slavery sentiment, which had maybe quieted slightly after 1850, just surged back stronger than ever.
And the political consequences were immediate.
Huge. The Kansas-Nebraska Act shattered the Democratic Party along sectional lines. Even more importantly, it led directly, almost spontaneously, to the birth of a brand new major party, the Republicans.
Entirely sectional, right? Based in the North.
Completely. It sprang up across the Midwest almost overnight. Pulled in former Northern Whigs, angry Free Soilers, anti-Nebraska Democrats, all united by one core principle: stopping the expansion of slavery into the territories. It was, as one source says, a mighty moral protest.
So the act didn't just repeal the 1820 Compromise.
It effectively killed the spirit of the 1850 Compromise, too, because Northern outrage made enforcing the Fugitive Slave Law almost impossible in many areas. It became a dead letter.
Senator Charles Sumner had that quote, didn't he, calling the Kansas-Nebraska Act
At once the worst and the best bill. Worst because of the immediate chaos and betrayal it represented. Best, maybe, because it finally stripped away all the illusions. It put freedom and slavery face to face and bids them grapple. No more compromise is possible, really.
So, tracking this period, 1848 to 1854, we go from the fight over the Mexican Cession through that uneasy temporary truce of 1850.
A truce bought with a poisonous law.
Right. And then, bam, Kansas-Nebraska in 1854 just blows the whole thing apart. It seems like the path to conflict is pretty much set after that.
It really does. Looking back, that compromise of 1850, for all its flaws, it probably did delay an outright shooting war for about a decade. And in that decade, the North continued to grow much stronger economically and industrially.
So time was ultimately on the North side.
It seems that way. The North was also solidifying its moral and political opposition to slavery's expansion. That extra decade might have been crucial for the eventual Union victory. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that made the confrontation almost inevitable.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? After the Whigs collapsed in '52 and the Republicans rose as this purely Northern party, was there any chance left for a national political solution to slavery by then? Could any law Congress passed after that point have possibly bridged that divide?
That's the question, isn't it? Something for you to definitely think about.
A heavy thought to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.